Dance holds a vital place in human nature. It contains it all: body, action, space, time, energy. No matter how many styles have evolved throughout history, dance has always played a significant cultural role. Much of the dance we see today has its roots in ballet. Despite its classical and, let's be honest, sometimes boring reputation, there was a time when dancers shattered the rules of classical ballet in pursuit of greater expressive freedom. It was bold, it was liberation, it was the greatest performance anyone could see. 1917. The Russian Revolution had begun. Up to 2 million people opposed to the new Red State fled the country. But as they left revolutionary Russia and made their way to Europe, not all realized that the West, too, was in the midst of revolution, just of a different kind. The early 20th century was a time of profound transformation in every aspect of human life, from modernist literature to Cubism, from Freud and psychoanalysis to Einstein's theory of relativity. Whether in science, fashion, politics, or art, change was everywhere. The cultural tectonic plates were shifting, reshaping the world into a new era, one that was frightening, ambiguous, uncomfortable, and shocking, but never lacking the fire of experimentation. And in the middle of this shift was this man. He had no talent, he had no money. All he wanted was to create a great show, but not just any show, the show. He became one of the most influential figures of the 20th century. He worked with Picasso, Matisse, and Chanel. He befriended the most aristocratic and artistic circles of the West. Among the audience at his performances were Virginia Woolf and Rodin. And he was destined to change the way we see dance forever. 1873. Paris is enjoying its most glorious era, La Belle Époque. With the Franco-Prussian War over, it is a time of peace, prosperity, and economic growth. Shopping centers are opening, money is flowing, Impressionism is in full swing, dancers are preparing to take the stage at the newly completed Palais Garnier, the famed Parisian opera house. Artists from around the world are flocking to Paris, debating the nature of art in the cafes of Montmartre. Naturally, in the era when fashion, art, and culture became synonymous with Paris, there were countless places devoted to pleasure. The wealthier citizens could indulge in cultural experiences like opera or ballet, a fact vividly documented in many Impressionist paintings. Degas was among them, in both respects. He didn't consider himself an Impressionist and kept somewhat aloof from the group, but he was deeply impressed by the possibilities of the new movement, the freedom and power it offered. Without the constraints of dignified subject matter, balanced compositions, or correct drawing. The artist was now accountable to no one but his own sensibilities for what he painted and how he painted it. And what Degas loved to paint were ballet dancers. He created over 1,000 works depicting them, performing, rehearsing, resting, captured in every possible movement and pose. Born into a music-loving family in Paris, he developed a fascination with ballet from a young age. But his beautiful paintings do more than just show impressions of form and space from unexpected angles. They also hint at the darker politics behind the scenes of the ballet world. The Rehearsal on the stage was painted by Degas in 1873. In it we see young girls yawning, scratching, stretching, entirely self-absorbed. All the ballerinas in Degas' painting are nameless. They're not meant to impress individually but collectively. All are observed by a man seated in a chair. He might be the director or choreographer, or, more likely, a particularly privileged friend of one of the girls. During performances, such friends often occupied the narrow boxes just behind where this man sits. It was a distinctive feature of the Grand Opera on the Rue Lepelletier. Built above rather than in front of the stage, these boxes were designed for those more interested in physical access than in aesthetic experience. To truly understand what's happening in this painting and how dark the reality was for these girls, let's take a step back. It all started in the Italian Renaissance, first as a ceremonial courtly dance performed for entertainment. As for the performers, it was a privilege reserved for men. Women joined later, once ballet evolved from courtly to professional performance. The major shift came during the Romantic era, in the first half of the 19th century, when female dancers became the center of attention. The typical roles of the Romantic repertoire, elves, spirits, fairies, made ballerinas the ideal performers, especially with the advent of point technique. Male dancers were gradually pushed into the background. Their primary task was now to support or lift the ballerinas, highlighting their lightness and grace. The lightness of Romantic technique was accompanied by a reduction in clothing. After all, elves float better without unnecessary ballast. The ballet costume was pared down to a sleeveless bodice and a flat white muslin skirt, giving the illusion of floating gently to earth. Originally calf-length, by Degas' time it has risen to the knee, which, as you might guess, opened up an entirely new kind of perspective for the viewer. In the 19th century, it was considered indecent for women to show their legs. So when the curtain rose and those short-skirted ballerinas began to move gracefully across the stage, stepping out, as one poet put it, with long, lovely, lascivious legs, the ladies in the audience could hardly contain their disapproval. "For shame!" they cried. Few men, however, expressed outrage. For some male spectators, ballet suddenly took on a different meaning, and the increasingly common choreographic choice to bring ballerinas closer to the footlights, more often than their male counterparts, likely cannot be explained by artistic reasons alone. Patronage of ballerinas became a favorite pastime for wealthy gentlemen, as the influence of theater subscribers grew steadily throughout the 19th century. Theaters increasingly relied on ticket sales, with subscribers attending at least once a week and renting boxes or stalls. It was good money for the theater. To keep subscribers interested, theaters occasionally resorted to methods that were less than artistic. The director of the Grand Opera granted access to the Foyer de la Danse, the dancers' rehearsal room, to some of his more refined clientele. It was open for visits during intermissions and after performances. Degas often sat there, sketching the scene. While ballet was a refined leisure for Parisian gentlemen, for many girls from poor backgrounds it was the only way out of poverty. They weren't paid much, but there was another kind of opportunity. Girls were considered fortunate if accepted into the opera dance school, the Académie Royale, at the age of 8 or 9. They typically made their first stage appearance at 14 or 15 and retired around 20 years later. A ballerina earned no more on stage than she might as a seamstress. With luck, however, she could attract the attention of a wealthy gentleman patron. Open the biography of nearly any 19th century Parisian ballerina, and you'll likely find the name of a rich and often influential man. In such cases, talent for dancing was not necessarily the deciding factor. That was the grim reality behind Degas' beautiful painting, The Rehearsal on the Stage. He was almost 40 at the time. He wasn't one of the ballerina's lovers. He observed them the way an impressionist might study a landscape, detached, uninterested in their moods or personalities. What fascinated him were their movements and gestures. Their faces were usually pale, anonymous. He once described them as animals in the act of washing themselves. Through Degas, ballet gained fame as a subject of painting, even as the stage art itself was in desperate need of innovation. "Ballet is dead and gone," wrote Charles Dickens in 1864. That may have been journalistic exaggeration, but by the 1880s, things were certainly looking grim. The tabloid press was filled with scandalous stories of impoverished corps de ballet girls turning to prostitution to make ends meet. Hardly a boost to ballet's reputation. What followed was a new era of ballet. a platform for artistic experimentation where individuality came to the forefront, led by the visionary Sergei Diaghilev, who set out from Russia to ravish the world. If you had to imagine a place in the middle of nowhere, Perm would certainly fit the bill. Situated at the foot of the Ural Mountains, the city was known as the starting point to the final, harrowing leg of the journey to Siberian prison camps. And in the center of that very city stood a handsome and substantial townhouse with 20 or so rooms. This is where Diaghilev was raised. Born in 1872, Diaghilev came from a family that once prospered through a vodka distillery business. Unfortunately, his father was not much of a businessman, and the family's fortunes became increasingly unstable. Though not particularly devoted to work, Diaghilev's father had a deep love for music, a passion shared by the whole family. Sergei took singing and piano lessons, and even tried his hand at composing. In 1890, he arrived in St. Petersburg to study law, but his true ambition was to join an exclusive and sophisticated cultural circle known as the Nevsky Pequequians. Unfortunately, Sergei Diaghilev was too provincial for inclusion in the group. One noticed that nobody ever saw him read a book, and he seemed entirely indifferent to spiritual questions or the fundamental problems of existence. He was too self-satisfied, too loud, too uncouth, and ultimately too rawly Russian in style for this westernized circle of men. But they couldn't ignore his infectious vitality. Like many ambitious provincials, Diaghilev was determined to make his mark in the big city. In Russia, ballet was a politically sensitive institution. The main theaters were owned by Tsar. This meant, first, that no one worried about box office returns. State funding was generous. Second, ballet retained its dignity. Standards were strictly upheld, and the prejudices of the imperial family went unquestioned. Also, unlike in Europe, Russian ballet upheld masculine traditions. Still, ballet was often seen as a lowbrow entertainment. When Tchaikovsky was asked to compose for the ballet, it might have been seen as the equivalent of writing for a soap opera today. Yet, after its premiere in 1890, The Sleeping Beauty became one of the shows that changed people's lives and tastes. Those same sophisticated young men were utterly enchanted. Some attended 6 times a week, or even twice a day. Diaghilev, however, wasn't particularly interested in ballet at the time. Together with his cousin, he set off on a low-budget student-style tour of Europe. Money was tight. His father's vodka business has gone bankrupt. But they managed to visit the cultural capitals – Paris, Venice, cities in Switzerland and Germany, Vienna, where Diaghilev saw his first ballet and wasn't impressed. The trip was a major turning point. Before this, Diaghilev had barely seen an art museum. Perm didn't have one. Now he began the process of self-education that would one day make him one of the leading arbiters of visual art in turn-of-the-century Russia and, eventually, the Western world. Diaghilev's greatest passion, though, was music, and here he faced a little problem. He had no particular talent. His singing lessons went nowhere. His dreams of becoming a composer were crushed in 1894, when he played his work for Rimsky-Korsakov, who bluntly told him he had no musical talent. Many would have been devastated. Diaghilev, however, was not so easily discouraged. He began collecting art, which soon sparked the idea of an exhibition or even a private gallery. It was then he seemed to recognize his true calling. Diaghilev wrote to his stepmother, "First of all, I'm a great charlatan, although one with flair. Second, I'm a great charmer. Third, I've great nerve. Fourth, I'm a man with a great deal of logic and few principles. And fifth, I think I lack talent. But if you like, I think I found my real calling, patronage of the arts. Everything has been given me, except money. Mais ça viendra, but it will come." Diaghilev might have become an art dealer. His early career focused on curating exhibitions. Then came a grander project, Mir Iskustva, the world of art, a lavish journal launched with a patronage from the Tsar himself. Eventually, seeking a new challenge, he joined the creative team at the Imperial Theaters in Moscow and St. Petersburg. But Diaghilev soon overplayed his hand, bombarding colleagues with ideas and disregarding matters of hierarchy and protocol. He was ultimately dismissed without right of appeal or pension, wording that implied disgrace and barred him from any future government service. In the long run, it meant that he would have to look beyond St. Petersburg to pursue his ambitions. In 1905, the fate of both Diaghilev and Russia hung in the balance. The country, reeling from defeat in the war with Japan and the catastrophe of Bloody Sunday, was entering its first wave of revolution. Diaghilev, after his own defeat in the Imperial Theater, moved on to the city where he, like many young artists of the time, could explore new possibilities. Paris. Paris, meanwhile, stood at the threshold of a new cultural era. Some artists were desperately trying to recover what they believed had been lost in Impressionism. A new generation was about to spark another revolution. In that same year, 1905, a group of young painters exhibited in Paris. They would become known as les Fauves, meaning the wild beasts or savages. They openly disregarded the forms of nature and enjoyed violent colors. The most famous among them was Henri Matisse. The young spirit of the 20th century craved something lighter, faster, subtler. It was drawn to anything that moved: bicycles, airplanes, motorcars, the perfectly timed slapstick of Buster Keaton and Charlie Chaplin, bold colors, and artistic self-expression. Diaghilev, bored easily, disdainful of repetition, and always chasing the new, fit right in. Between 1906 and 1908, he staged a major art exhibition in Paris, followed by a series of concerts and a production of the opera Boris Godunov, which earned international acclaim. All gorgeously staged and all unmistakably Russian. The shows drew widespread attention. One concert even sparked a small riot, which Diaghilev later recalled with delight. He adored scandal. In short, it was a success. Paris wanted something new, something fresh, and Diaghilev, like Matisse, was ready to deliver. He then returned to St. Petersburg to plan his next move, a full season of Russian opera in Paris. But that would be ruinously expensive. A solution emerged. What if he added something cheaper to the program? Russian ballet. In 1990, Diaghilev returned to Paris with a troupe of classical dancers, later known as les Ballets Russes. Virginia Woolf once said, on or around December 1910, human character changed. What she meant has long been debated. Was she referring to developments in air travel or polar exploration, or maybe post-impressionism? Maybe all of them or none at all. Still, no one could deny that something was in the air. It's also worth noting that in that same year, 1910, the Oxford English Dictionary recorded the first use of the term avant-garde. A few years later, another word was added: Balletomania. Diaghilev first offered Paris his stars: Pavlova, Karsavina, and Nijinsky, the jewels of Russian ballet, performing in Fokin's choreography, who would later be known as the father of modern ballet. Nijinsky held a special place in what would become the Ballets Russes. He was the one who brought the male dancer back to center stage for European audiences, who had barely acknowledged male dancers at all, until Nijinsky came along. Once the Ballets Russes became the thing to see, Nijinsky was the magnet that kept seats full. Charlie Chaplin called him a god of passionate sadness. Auguste Rodin invited him to pose in his studio. He was a real star, not to mention the male star. But Diaghilev wanted more, not just to transport famous dancers in costume, but to bring an entire theatrical and musical culture to Paris. This is when he decided to play the Russian card in full. One of the sensations of those first performances was Fokin's Polovtsian dances. This wasn't pink slippers and classical restraint. It was raw, wild Russia, barbaric exoticism in a riot of primary colors, accompanied by an exuberant chorus. No wonder the Polovtsian dances were an immediate, smashing hit. What Diaghilev also happily brought to the public was a new level of sexiness on stage. A lover of scandal and always open about his own sexual preferences, he was eager to push boundaries, as far as possible without having the police called. The true star in this regard was Ida Rubinstein. Though born into a deeply orthodox family, Ida was boundless both in her wealth and in her daring approach to nudity on stage. She didn't dance, she walked. Someone from the troupe once said, but how she walked. Suddenly, this wild Russian primitiveness and naïveté proved more progressive and more elaborate than most of what Paris had yet created. Of course, that primitivism was carefully crafted, a market-savvy illusion fully tailored by its creator. From the very beginning, Diaghilev showed his true talent as an impresario. Despite extravagant costs, he always found a way to fund the show. And though the music and dance were 100% Russian, the repertoire was finely tuned to Parisian tastes. The golden rule, know your audience, was perfected by Diaghilev. After that season, every door was open to him. His calls were answered, new projects discussed. Diaghilev was ready to move in an even bolder, more aggressive creative direction. But he wasn't alone in presenting a new aesthetic to Paris. In 1910, another dance sparked scandal. Not on stage, but in art salons. Henri Matisse's dance. Matisse's dance reflected the evolution of dance itself, an ode to life, joy, and physical abandon. It became an emblem of modern art, with its bold colors, raw energy, and figures inspired by primitive and folk traditions. It expressed instinct and nature. All of this could just as easily be said of the Ballets Russes. Unapologetic, expressive, extravagant, rooted in its folk culture. These were no longer Degas' soft impressionist ballerinas. It was a Fauvist rage, erupting on stage. The next program introduced the Firebird, followed later by Petrushka, both rooted in national folklore and inspired by Russian folk tales, with music by Igor Stravinsky. Scheherazade, choreographed more like early cinema than classical ballet, was violently sadistic and caused an instant sensation, with Ida Rubinstein radiating as the lascivious femme fatale, all glamour and provocative poses, of course. By the end of 1911, the Ballets Russes had become the fashionable name in Europe, with tours to the Americas on the horizon. Diaghilev also hoped to bring the company back home to St. Petersburg, but his habit of success stirred toxic envy in Russia. Rumors spread that he cared more about lining his own pockets than promoting Russian art. Entirely false, but persistent enough to drive away any potential sponsors. The official verdict was clear. He couldn't be trusted. So Diaghilev did what he did best. He moved on and made things happen. Now more open to risk and experimentation, it was time to rewrite the rules. Diaghilev presented a new ballet. The Rite of Spring, the company's most controversial and legendary ballet, premiered in 1913, choreographed by Nijinsky to a groundbreaking score by Stravinsky. It was like nothing audience had ever seen, complex and jarring. Its strange, primal movements were the antithesis of traditional ballet. There were no graceful poses. Everything is ugly, one critic wrote. About the score, he added, the most dissonant music yet composed. But others rushed to its defense. One called it a new kind of wilderness, both un-art and art at the same time. Even the elderly Auguste Rodin publicly took up the cause. Diaghilev had wanted a scandal, and he got one indeed. The ballet caused a riot at its Paris premiere. Some in the audience felt personally insulted. Commercially, it was a sellout. The Rite of Spring would go on to become one of the defining cultural events of the 20th century. It was a turning point, violent, misunderstood, but visionary. In that moment, as William Yeats once wrote of political chaos in Ireland, a terrible beauty is born. The beginning of the First World War brought dramatic change not only to Europe, but to Diaghilev himself. His father died. To pay his respects, he crossed contested borders. Still hoping to present his ballet in Russia, he didn't know this journey would be his last trip to his homeland. Later, during the violent upheaval of 1917, Diaghilev received a telegram inviting him to return to Russia as Minister of Culture. He declined the offer. Around this time, Diaghilev made a bold shift in the company. He abandoned the exoticism and eroticism, heavily Russian-inflected, that had made the Ballets Russes famous, and redirected the company toward international modernism. he began working with composers from the young Parisian group Les Six and brought in modernist artists to design sets and costumes. Among them were Matisse, Braque, Miro, Derain, and Max Ernst. But there was one artist who stood out in the crowd, the young Pablo Picasso. Picasso transformed the Ballets Russes. Before him, stage decor played a minimal role. It merely looked on. But Picasso's bold, commanding designs demanded attention. He also helped shift the troupe's focus from dance to full theatrical spectacle. In turn, he gained much from Diaghilev, not just professionally but personally. His first wife, Olga Koklova, was one of the company's dancers. Picasso spent years working with the Ballets Russes, designing for Diaghilev and experimenting with form and line. Like many artists before him, he found the company's energy a powerful creative force, one that pushed his work in new directions. And much like Degas decades earlier, he portrayed the dancers in every possible form, from resting to rehearsing. This artistic turn gave rise to perhaps the most surreal ballet of the century, Parade. Parade became a dream collaboration between some of the finest avant-garde talent of the era. Cocteau wrote the scenario, Picasso designed the sets and costumes, and the maverick composer, Eric Satie, created a collage-like score incorporating the random sounds of everyday life. Diaghilev, in exile, loved Russia all the more intensely. But Parade revealed just how far his aesthetic had traveled from his roots. Its premiere in Paris in May 1917 would go down in history as the moment the avant-garde elbowed its way into the heart of elite European culture. Its tone was surreal. The choreography featured stiff, marionette-like movements of the upper body and arms, evoking silent cinema and the mechanistic obsessions of the futurists. It was an animated cartoon on stage, clearly not to be taken seriously, a smug delight in its own modernist irony and ingenuity. As expected and even hoped for, the spectacle provoked booing, whistling, and cheering in equal measure. Real bedlam, as one observer put it. But in a way, Parade was the perfect show for an era when everything was falling apart. It reflected a world in which nothing made sense anymore. Writers, artists, and composers felt free to engage with popular culture in a spirit of exuberant parody and knockabout fun. No more staring into misty impressionist horizons, no more vast, cloudy symbols of high romance. Now the light was bright and electric, the mood upbeat. This was the moment when the Ballets Russes turned away from its Russian roots, questioned classical dance training, rejected traditional theater craft, and gave young painters a billboard for their experimental art. Being hired by Diaghilev became a way to establish value. Your work would be seen by a wide audience of wealthy, art-savvy opinion makers, not to mention Diaghilev's reputation as a talent spotter. In his final years, Diaghilev began collecting old Russian books and letters, likely as an expression of nostalgia for his homeland. Russia still called to him, not least because his family was in trouble. His half-brother Valentin had been arrested and sent to a prison camp. Through contacts, Diaghilev persuaded the French ambassador in Moscow to intervene. Presumably as a result, Valentin was spared, though not released. Diaghilev had been diagnosed with diabetes, but largely ignored medical advice. In late summer 1929, he traveled to his beloved Venice. As usual, he checked into a plush hotel. 10 days later, he died of blood poisoning. A few weeks later, the Soviets shot Valentin. Smart people know who they are. Diaghilev knew his talents and his worth. "What exactly is it you do?" a King Alfonso asked Diaghilev at the reception. "Your Majesty, I am like you," he replied. "I don't work, I do nothing, but I am indispensable." Today, Sergei Diaghilev is remembered primarily as the founder and director of the most glamorous dance troupe in history, the Ballets Russes. But he did more than that. He saved ballet from certain death. Without him, the art form might never have become what it is today. How did he do it? He was neither an intellectual nor a theorist, and he had no creative gift of his own. First, He was a brilliant producer. Like all great generals, he listened carefully to a trusted few, was always open to new ideas, but ultimately made all major decisions himself. Diaghilev's genius lay in spotting talent, bringing the right people together, and making things happen. Without his authority, nothing would have moved. Also, like many people who get things done, Diaghilev was a hustler. Wooing the rich and well-connected often seemed to be his main occupation as director of the troupe. Another key to Diaghilev's success: name-dropping. The Ballets Russes broke boundaries in costume design, staging, and music by collaborating with some of the era's greatest visual artists. From concept to final performance, the company embodied artistic synergy. Diaghilev envisioned productions where music, dance, and design worked as equals. Naturally, many legendary names were involved. The Ballets Russes was where Picasso met Stravinsky and Chanel, where Stravinsky met Nijinsky, Matisse, Cocteau, and Balanchine, and where Nijinsky wore costumes by Bakst and Benoit, was sculpted by Rodin, photographed by Drouet and Demeuillet, sketched by Cocteau, and danced the original scores by Stravinsky, Ravel, and Debussy. And the audience? Everyone from Charlie Chaplin to King George V. One more secret to Diaghilev's success was as old as time: sex, which, as we know, sells. In Degas' ballet era, sex remained an offstage topic. With Diaghilev, it was everywhere. There was an orgy in Scheherazade that bordered on softcore pornography, fetishism in the faun, and acrobatic coitus in the prodigal son. Perhaps the most enduring aspect of the Ballets Russes was their use of music. Previously, ballet had been performed to existing musical scores, where choreographers did their best to match the steps to the music. Diaghilev commissioned original compositions tailored to each choreography, allowing dancers to embody the music and bring greater character and cohesion to the performance. Costume design saw bold experimentation as well. The stiff classical bodice was replaced by psychedelic, multicolored pajamas in Polovtsian dances, sleek modern silhouettes by Chanel, and radical scenic styles drawn from neo-primitivism, cubism, and constructivism. Later in life, Diaghilev's friend Benoit offered perhaps the clearest insight into Diaghilev's supreme gift. He was not a creative genius. He was perhaps rather lacking in creative imagination, but he had one characteristic, one ability, which none of us had and which made of him what he later became. He knew how to will a thing, and he knew how to carry his will into practice. Diaghilev knew how to galvanize others, how to inspire and discard, how to motivate and bring visions to life. He knew how to make things happen, and in the end, execution is everything. It was perhaps inevitable that when Diaghilev died in 1929, the company folded instantly. And one might ask, how did ballet become so, boring? Part of the answer lies in the curse of respectability, in the longing for a lost Eden where everything is clear, orderly, and safe. By the 1940s, the barriers had been broken. There was little left to shock. Ballet retreated into the comfort of polite tradition, reviving 19th century classics like Giselle, Swan Lake, The Sleeping Beauty, and The Nutcracker. Nice, clean, understandable. Another issue was money. Diaghilev's model combined a mix of classics and new daring works, financed by a precarious blend of private patronage and ticket sales. But by the 60s, that model was no longer sustainable. Public subsidies through government grants or tax relief for donors became essential. With them came boardroom oversight, regulations, and accountability. And with state funding came the expectation of high culture, where, as ever, tradition tends to smoother experimentation. But the creative spirit always finds a way. Most of Diaghilev's ballets disappeared, but his ballet masters did not. He didn't just launch Western ballet, he staffed it. The major companies of England, France, and the United States were led by Diaghilev's former dancers and choreographers. Diaghilev didn't just know how to make things happen, he put individuality on stage. No more nameless dancers with vague futures. He gave us bold artists, daring visions, and names to remember. And that tradition continues. He showed us, don't be ashamed of where you're from, but embrace it. Don't fear a lack of talent, but work hard. Don't listen to what they say, but do your thing. Just do the show.